Hello and welcome to the Sher Academy. We are starting a brand new project for the year 5786, and that is to invite the leading on the online world to share with us some thoughts on some basic questions that I still have, having read the parasha and having read some of the commentaries. I'm still left with some questions, and then it's those questions that I wanted to present to our guests. And today we're going to be recording Bereshit, and I'm delighted to have with us Levitas, who was one of my first teachers when I arrived here in Sfat in search for truth. So I'm super grateful for you giving us the time, and would like to start with just asking you, out of all the parashot that we offered, what made you choose Bereshit as the one that you wanted to connect with?
Bereshit is that of revelation, is that of letters. It's that which starts the notion of book. It's actually, I said that of revelation. We know that Rabbi Shmuel Cohen Gadol had this revelation of the divine as three divine names. It's recorded in Maser Brachot. And those three divine names actually have the same gematria as Bereshit bara Elokim. There is something very ancient about that, very obviously very ancient, but also very, very grounded. And it actually relates to something which I see as a mission in relation to the letters, the Hebraic letters. In fact, it's been already demonstrated. Proven would be, a strong term. I'm a mathematician, so proven is difficult. But it has been shown that all scripts, and I'm not saying that from people who are, who come from like the Jewish world and come from an aspect of in a way, seeing this halo of of uniqueness for the Hebraic letters, but saying that all scripts, and that means, Indo-European, all scripts actually come out of what we call the Ktav Hashut. So we're not saying the languages come, but in the question of script, there's an alphabet. And we have this beautiful Zohar that looks at the first pasuk of Bereshit and says that Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim u'et haaretz, says that the divine created the alphabet of the heavens and the alphabet of the earth and made those correspondences. And as a mathematician, for me, it's like, and I know I'm going to use some jargon which is not, always accessible, but it's about primal space and dual space. And it's something fundamental in mathematics. And in a way, it's this fundamental duality between Shamayim Ba'aretz, which is expressed with the letters, and understanding correspondences. I think, in a way, the rest of the Torah actually makes usage of that, in each and every usage of letter. So yes, that's one of the reasons why I connect to Pasha Bereshit.
Well, very good. So I'm really grateful for us to have this opportunity, and I want to start with my first question, and it is this, and that it seems to me quite unusual that God, the perfect creator of the perfect world, would create Adam. And as he says in verse 18, chapter 2, and God said, it is not good for man to be alone. In fact, if I'm right, it says this is one of the few times that God describes anything as not good. And then he says, I will make a helper corresponding to him. And then we go through to hear about Chava being created and presented to Adam. And I'm just left with a puzzle as to why God would have decided to create Adam imperfect initially, in order to declare that it's not good for him to be alone, and then go ahead and proceed to create a soulmate for him, given that in all other cases of creation, the male and female were created together.
Well, first, when we call her Hawa, it's actually a projection because she is not named in the actual text of the Torah. We see that she isn't named Hawa until after the fall. That is, at the beginning, she is called in a way the feminine counterpart, which was built, as we know the term is actually used as such, which was built from this backside, this tzela. As we know, there are numerous discussions among the sages as to what does tzela mean, right? But Rashi actually answers your question in saying there was this possibility for confusion. That is, it's not an imperfect state. It's actually in a two perfect state, in a state where one would think, well, maybe there is actually two reshuyot. There is one above, where the Holy One, blessed be He, is actually alone and doesn't have a feminine counterpart, doesn't have a wife. And then one would think, well, that's among the higher beings. You look in the lower beings, and whom do you find? Well, you find Adam. And so, in other words, one would say, well, there are actually, two dominions. There is that which is in heaven, that which is more down, and that which corresponds to the divine, and that which corresponds to Adam. In other words, making it two dominions. And so Rashi says, in order to prevent that, confusion, there was this understanding that this characteristic of levado doesn't correspond to Adam. It could start like that, because that's exactly the process of the divine saying, Bet salmenu kidmotenu. So be just like us, just like him. And that meant having him alone. But then if he's alone, then he just so much like him that by the end you can't even distinguish him from him. So it's actually not imperfection. It's too much perfection.
Wow.
For Adam.
Interesting. Anything else you wanted to say about that?
There's also the matter about, what is it we call Adam Rishon? The Zohar goes into different places, in particular in Parashat Truma. If you had asked me for another Parashat than Bereshit, I would have told you Parashat Truma, or maybe Parashat Mishpatim, as we all know. But anyway, the fact is that Parashat Truma contains this discourse, which is called the Ma'amar Bered Rav Safra, the discourse of the son of Rav Safra, and which is an extraordinary basis for Kabbalah. That is, it's a mistake not to do, is not to take Kabbalah and understand what's written in this discourse in the Zohar. It's to do the opposite. To actually take this discourse in the Zohar and ask questions about one's supposed understanding and knowledge in Kabbalah. And the Arizal does that. And one of the things that you learn from this discourse is the fact that there is no such thing really as Adam Arishon. In a sense that it's not really Adam. That is, what you have originally is even you have a first Adam and a second Adam. Now, I'm not going to go into discussions about why. You've had great thinkers like the Rav Soloveitchik, who was talking about the first Adam, the second Adam, and he was explaining things that were more psychological in their nature, or developmental. But in Kabbalah, we look at something else. We actually look at the fact that the Adam we talk about in Torah, though a tradition has talked about it as being Adam Rishon, it's really about Adam Kadmon. So in other words, it's a prototype of Adam, and it's really a manifestation of the divine down.
Okay, so my next question is linked with that, and that is that in between God saying, I'm going to create a corresponding helper for him, in verse 18, before he actually goes ahead and does that, in verse 21, he says that Hashem casts a deep sleep onto the man, a tardema. And in between that, we have about 3 pasukim, which is an instruction for Adam to name all the animals, which he does. And at the end of that, it says, and Adam did not find a helper corresponding to him, suggesting that perhaps the whole exercise was to find a helper for him, or a soulmate for him, And I find that really strange to think that, that he would possibly find one in an animal. And so there must be a reason for that. And I'm just curious what you feel the reason is and why we have this injection of these three pasukim where we're naming the animals before Chava is separated from Adam and brought to him.
Look, we can answer this at so many levels. There's one level which is typical Gemara, so we could call this at the level of Drush, which is unfortunately saying that that Adam would have united with all that existed, and only when actually his feminine counterpart was created, was formed, was actually built from him, did he realize, oh, this is the one. It's very unfortunate that things are expressed that way. On the other hand, it's wonderful realism that our sages dare to talk like that. But there's so many other levels about this. There's also a level where you see that just like Hevel after him, who had the wife, some say the wives, but also had access to God. Which was in terrible contrast to Cain, who had no wife, didn't have any access to God. Really. So you had one who had everything, one who didn't have a thing. And in a way, Cain will be, as the firstborn of Adam later on, will reproduce this same, I wouldn't call it a process, I would just more call it it's the same paradigm. And what is that paradigm? We have this tradition that at that point, Adam had just had, as we understand, finished the first 6 days. He was about to finish the first 6 days of creation. It was on the very same day that he was created. All this that you mentioned, those psukim, and the 5 previous days, what we call the last 5 days of any year, right? From the 25th of Elul, day of creation of the world, till the 29th included. That was the first 5 days. And we actually have this beautiful outlook on it, which says that they correspond to the 5 end letters. And this process will again be reenacted with Rabbi Akiva finding his 5 Talmidim in the south of Israel, right? Because Rabbi Akiva, just like Nahum Gamzu, his master, was a northerner, right? He was of the north of Israel, just like us now today. And each one of these students that were new to the approach of Rabbi Akiva, right? And in particular, the last one, Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, has this tradition about, it's recorded in the Talmud Bavi in Maseret Yevamot 63a. And you have there fascinating discussion about 7 characteristics. He starts with Isha. He goes with the matter of Karka, the actual land where you grow things. And he goes into matter about Zot. And those characteristics, each one of them teaches you something. So, of course, I'm not going to go into each one of those characteristics because it would take us all the podcast. But actually, if you want to look at them, there's one of them, which is this Zot, which is, again, what Adam will say at the point that his feminine counterpart is actually built. He will say, wow, Zot. This is the one which is the myself, this is the self of myself. Because more than a question of bones, Etzem is really like about the self. And what did we have here? Well, at the point that he named each one of those animals, right? Because we have another tradition, there's another, stratum in the matter of understanding, is to say that when we talk about those Ofa Shamayim, or we're talking about, like birds, and there is this idea that one is talking about certain angelic structures. Yet there is also the fact that they were animals, in the sense of not being Adam. And this Zot is actually at the heart of something which was the very saying, the very motto, the very approach of the master of Rabbi Akiva, Nachum Ish Gamzu, the famous Gamzu Letova. Not as some type of fatalism of saying in any way, by the end, it's all good, it's all good by the end. No, it's not saying that. He's saying, he's taking the zoo as being reality, and he's transforming it through a process which is called Gam, and he's transforming into Tova. Now, if you look back at the stories that concern Nachum Ish Gamzu, you'll see that that transformation is being exemplified through all kinds of different ways. And following this Torah of Nachum Ish Gamzu, we actually know that the expression, which will come later on about Yaakov Avinu and Rachel, about Gam et Zot, that Gam et Zot was the actual basis for the Gamzu. That is, in the Gamzu Letova, the Gam et Zot was the process, and that's where you actually had this great secret about how do you actually deal with reality. And in those times, you had two approaches to Torah, two, I would call, approaches to hermeneutics. And one which was what we call the Klal Ufrat, where you look at generalities and particulars. And that was the approach in the South. That was Rabbi Nechonia ben Akana and his students, Rabbi Ishmael, and all the ones that followed, including Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. We actually learned this debate as to know which system did you follow, and it's very clear that he was following that of Rabbi Ishmael, so that of Rabbi Nechonia ben Akana, which is about Klal Ufrat. So you actually look at generalities and particularities, and you actually make the connection between them. In a way, it's very much in phase with this idea of putting labels on things. It had influence till the Ramak, till Rabbi Moshe Cordovero here in Tzfat in question of Kabbalah. Then you had another approach, and that approach was that of expansions and contractions, was that of looking at those processes. It's about flows, and matters are allowed to amplify or they more limit. Two very different approaches. And when Rabbi Akiva lost his famous thousands of pairs of students here in the north, he was forced to go south. But the students he taught had no clue about any of this. And he started back, anew. Where Rabbi Akiva was taught 22 years by Nachum Ish Gamzu. For each one of the letters of the Aleph Bet, actually, we had this new process that we are enacting each and every year, which is that instead of having one day where everything takes place, which was this Yom Shishi of creation, and then you go into Shabbat. Certainly we'll talk more about this, but then you actually had to wait. Wait for what? Wait for Simchat Torah. Wait for Yom Sheni Chag Atzeret. And what is the date of Yom Sheni Chag Atzeret? Chav Bet B'Tishrei. So you actually made a process where you went from one day to actually 22 days. And so that's kind of the structure that one is dealing with. And in that process, there is something where you can all look at the very particulars of this, which is like, he has a wife, he doesn't have a wife, all those matters. Or you look at really what's going on behind this, which is those matters of inclusion. And the first inclusion we have is obviously in the first pasuk of Bereshit. Et hashamayim we et haaretz. It's to include. Now, of course, we don't have such a term, and it's very unique to Hebrew. We don't have any other language where the direct object is actually given by a term. This is the et, the we et. You don't have that in any other language. So, in a way, what you have behind, even behind the notion of ishto, his wife, right? We have this Torah which explains that in the term ishto is just like we'et, only that you add a shin. What is that shin doing there, and what does it do? So there's a lot we can continue on this in the same way that between ish and isha, as we know, it's a matter that ish has the yud, whereas isha has the he, right? And you have the matter of the yud ke. So you have those plays with the letters, which makes a difference. For him, originally, there wasn't so much a need. That is, relative to him, there wasn't a need. It's more, as we explained before, it's more that relative to the divine, there was a need to actually differentiate Adam. And that's where the process of Vayikra, right? Because that's what Adam does. He actually gave them Shemot, right? And it is this term of Vayikra is actually related to the Yabasha, to the dry land, and the dry land itself is considered as being an emergence. And what I just said now is actually Gemara Meforeshet, which explains that the term Yabasha has this gematria of 317, which is the same gematria as Vayikra. So in other words, he lets, through those names, he lets each and one of those entities emerge and not be, behind this veil of, like you call them waters, you could, call them screen. But so he gives them an existence to each one of them, just like the dry land appears as the water goes away.
Interesting. Lots to think about. Okay, so let me get to the third question, which is really the heart of what's bothering me here. And that is the whole idea, God created the perfect world and we're putting the garden and all we have to do is just wait, as you said. And all of a sudden, there's this new character introduced, the Nachash, the snake. And as a result of that, we fell as a mankind, and we're still paying for that fall today. I mean, it's such a significant fall. So my question is, who invited the Nachash into the garden? I had understood that none of the animals were in the garden, that they were outside the garden, but who invited him in? And if he was simply a tool for the Satan to manipulate and to create his problems, who invited the Satan to come in? And why would Hashem kind of create not a certainty, but a very high likelihood of a fall because of the injection or the allowing of the Satan to be in the party? This is really what's really bothering me. And because if you put 1,000 people into Adam's position, I would imagine that all of them would fall. It seemed to me, it kind of like it's a setup to fall, and therefore, why would God create that scenario?
Well, there are a few characters here in the plot. Not only there's the Nachash, but there is also the garden, right? And there is the idea of Etz Nechmad, there is the idea of Etz Chaim, there is the idea of Etz Hadat, and there is the idea of the creator, right? And all those things are distinguished one from the other. The fact is that, in your previous question, you mentioned that, they give name to animals. And now we're saying that actually animals were not there. Well, clearly they were there in one form or the other. Of course, it depends what is it that you call those animals. I mean, what those animals were actually. The Nachash, is really about the root itself. Has nothing to do with the snake. It's really about the ability for divination. In fact, the Nachash in his words is the first one who brings this type of speculative future. If you look in the Torah, the first time that you have this usage of the future tense in a speculative way, not as a consequence, but a speculation, right? You will not die. And that matter, that bringing of the future, is really related to what will be. This is at the heart also of what made the garden. There's a whole question about what does the Eden, Eden, what does it mean? In all languages, great linguist Umberto Cassuto, who said that he knew, he has researched that the root of Eden was related to the Ugaritic, meaning what is thoroughly watered. And that's why the psukim, much before a matter of Cheta Adam, Arishon, Hakadmon, however you call them, it talks about the water coming out of the Eden, because it is a garden which is thoroughly watered, and it gives you those four, prototypal or mythological rivers, right? And we have, since in antiquity, we've had this identification of those rivers as being one which actually flows southward, as being the Ganges in India. It's Josephus who actually gives the first, who hands down this tradition to us and telling us that that's how they understood the tradition of Moshe Rabbeinu in his time. He introduces it like that. And so then what is the second, the Gihon, what is it? It actually corresponds to the Nile. But the Nile has this characteristic that it actually flows northward, right? From the mountains till the Nile, till what we call today Cairo. So it actually flows northward. So it's about a direction. And then you have the Tigris, which is on the east. And it says it's eastward to the land of Ashur. And then on the west of it, what do you have? The Euphrates. In fact, one of the reasons that in our tradition, the city of Baghdad had such an importance wasn't the fact that the Tigris and the Euphrates come to almost together, and then they separate back again. And where they come almost together, canals had been built from the Euphrates to the Tigris in order to allow both waters to be there in Baghdad, which in its first origin, means the gift of God. Now there you had, so what was the symbol of this southward, northward, this going to the east or to the west? It was a matter of southward is about what is that comes from above. And so really, it's a consequence of what is above. So it goes with the four fundamental questions of what is above. What actually went northward was what was below, and can explain a lot of what the Arizal taught us about what concerned Pharaoh, what concerns Shmot Elokim, and what concerns that actually it comes from down, structures that are down. So what is below? And then there is what is before, and that's obviously the east. And then what comes after, and that's obviously the west, because of the rotation of our world, because of the flow of time in relation to this rotation. So what we have is this idea that what comes after is really what this Nachash is all about, because it's about divination. It's about what will come after, what will be after. And that's why he makes this first usage of this speculative future, because that's what he is about. In a way, there is the profound desire to know what will be. And the idea here of the feminine counterpart of Adam falling and eating that fruit is really telling us about her embracing whatever narrative one has given her, thrown to her about what will be. Now, the Arizal goes into saying, what is this thing what is it that they knew? What is it, this etzadat? He says, well, the first usage of the actual verb is in Adam knowing Hawa. And so he says that really what took place was this tragic impatience. They united on their day of their own creation or formation, and they did not wait for Yom Shabbat Kodesh. Etzadat Tovara was not something which was pushed away, beyond any limit in time. No, we have an understanding, and we know that different of our sages, including the Or Chaim, discusses that, and saying that actually it was the Kiddush that was meant to be on Shabbat. And some say it was the Lechem. the bread. And actually the matter of, knowing if you do kiddush, whether you do it on bread or whether you do it on wine, and lechem v'yayin, that's the matter of chita and gif. That's why the Seder said, what are the candidates for etzadat of vara? It was or chita, gifen, or tena. And so what is the matter of tena, world of tena? Why do you think they hide themselves with fig leaves if it wasn't the fruit that they ate from? So that's, and unfortunately, as we know, in the non-Jewish world, one talked about the apple, and we know why, right? Because it's a matter of Latin, between the term malum and malum. Malum, which not an extended A, actually means evil. So they thought, of good and evil. But malum, with the A is extended, is actually means an apple. So that's how, they kind of made some type of shortcut. But our tradition, not even just our tradition, the pshat of the text tells you, well, if they had to cover themselves, were about their nakedness, it's because they had actually united. Not only they had united, but it is exactly the leaf from the fruit that it corresponds to this uniting, actually, which is the fig tree. So, in other words, of the possibilities of Chagat, right, which goes also with Chesed Gevurah Tiferet and gives you another, an approach to what is Etzadat, there was something which was just prohibited for the moment, but it was left for later on, where it would even become a mitzvah, the mitzvah of Adam and his feminine counterpart uniting, the mitzvah of kiddush, the mitzvah of taking this bread, of partaking of this bread on Shabbat, the chita for the bread, the giffen for the wine, and the tena for their union. And that was the matter. It was not something which was inherently wrong. It was just wrong at the moment. And the Nachash exploited the fact that there was this present moment for them, and they couldn't stay in that moment. They had to go about, in particular, what will be. Now, one could go on into explaining this, much further, but I think that the idea of connecting the Nachash to the matter of divination, to the matter of not just prediction, but actually divining, saying what will be, and this usage of future by the Nachash is very key here.
But it's beautiful what you said. I'm just still left with the question why Hashem would inject into the garden this temptation to divination and looking at the future.
Well, it's more like, why did time flow already at that point? That's the matter. What you're really asking is that, as long as you're not able to stay in that present moment where you have nothing to do with what will be, and you don't know, there's no anxiety about it, there's nothing where you actually relate to what will be, then there's nothing that affects you at that level. But at the point that they were affected, that they felt affected about one talking to them about, well, there's that possibility, this may very well be at that point, that you accept that actually there's this flow of time, that by itself is what relates to this Nachash. So these characters and these entities are really there to just tell us about that process more than about the elements that were there. In a way, my answer is very much a Rabbi Akiva type of answer, because I'm looking more about the process itself than about the particulars of what you have inside the story. You see, that's where Rabbi Ishmael would have a completely different answer. In fact, that's the reason that the Talmud Yerushalmi tells you that in answering those 4 questions, that it's really Rabbi Akiva who had a problem with answering them. Why? Because he said, if you actually go into answering what was below, what is above, what is those things, then you are going to start to talk about particulars. But then if you do that, you're going to miss the sense of the process. So in his sense, you don't talk about those things, because if you do, you're going to talk about the generalities, the particulars, etc. But for Rabbi Ishmael, no, he's saying it because he sees the essence of things in looking at those generalities and particulars. So, you're not going to answer them. No, you're going to look at this as a warning. And that's how Rabbi Ishmael looks at them. He looks at this matter of saying the one who looks at all those questions, who tries to answer the question, is better that he would not have come to the world as written in Mishnah and Maseret Chagiga. But Rabbi Ishmael says, no, it's not that's exactly like that. It's more like these are warnings. And so they had no problem talking about it. Whereas for Rabbi Akiva, it was saying, no, these are the processes. And just the way you ask those questions, you're asking what actually was before, what will be after. No, it's about more like what is making the time flow. What is that matter where you go from matters that are unknown to matters that become known? It's a completely different approach.
So could you dispel the notion that I've been hearing that really ultimately God wanted Chava to eat from the tree so that she could descend, they could both descend, and so that Hashem could create a dira tachton, mamash tachton underneath. Could you dispel that idea, or
Yes,
are we saying that he did not want them to eat? That's it.
No, he didn't want. He wanted them to actually, have only one day of Rosh Hashanah, which would have been this Yom Shabbat Kodesh. One would actually have reached the end of Shabbat, and we have this tradition that says that at that point there would be no Shkia, so there would be no sunset. It would be another phenomenon altogether. So it wasn't supposed to be. In other words, you were not supposed to have all those days of Yamim Noraim. You were not supposed to have Yom Kippurim. You were not supposed to have even Sukkot. You were supposed to have Shabbat as Simchat Torah. That is what was supposed to be.
Please God, when Mashiach comes, we'll experience that. So let's go to the next question, and that is that we're explained in great detail how the Nachash persuaded Chava to eat from the tree. And the Torah goes into a lot of details on how it changed her own perception of the tree, and it appealed to her. And then when she's eaten, she gives it to Adam, and apparently all the animals. But we're never explained how she persuaded Adam to eat, which is curious because Adam heard himself from Hashem that this is not allowed, and there was no misunderstanding about whether you should touch it or not touch it or just not eat it. How did she persuade him to actually fall with her?
That's a very, very, very beautiful question, but it has to do again with the way you approach this. Rabbi Akiva would refuse to answer your question that way. Why? Because he would say, what's written? It's written, Watiten Gam Leisha. She gave it also to her man with her. So it's not just the gam as also, which is, by the way, the first usage of the term gam, which is in the Torah of Rabbi Akiva. It's a matter of those expansions. You have two types of expansions, gam and et, and two types of contractions, which are rak and ach. And the first gam comes here. So he would tell you, well, by saying that, you actually put emphasis again on the persona and on those entities which are there talked about. But really what's interesting is the fact that one talks about this first process of gam, of expansion. And it's about the sequence. And the next gam you would have, by the way, is as the divine tells them, look, it wasn't really the matter of you not taking Etzadat Tova. It was a matter of sequence. You were supposed to first eat of Etzachaim, partake of Etzachaim, and then when I would allow it to take Etzadat Tova. But because you went directly with Etzadat Tova, you're going to go into the other sequence, the reverse sequence, which is going from Etzadat Tova to Etzachaim. And that reverse sequence is what was not supposed to be. And it's a matter of having a sense of things, of knowledge of this dichotomy between Tov and Ra, and then going into this unification of Achaim. Achaim doesn't have this type of dichotomy, right? And so it was going from this dichotomy to those two elements to actually this united thing. It wasn't supposed to be like that. You didn't have to go to separating to actually unifying back. And so by doing so, one went really against the normal order of things. But if you went from unification to actually a separation that the gods allowed for another purpose that we don't really exactly understand, right? Which is the reason why that we look at those structures where we call them sefirot, partsufim, or however, of right, left, middle, right? So originally, the Arizal says that everything was about, a straight line with a curve. There was no right, left, and middle. This right, left, and middle comes later on. And it was not a problem that it would go from this straight line to actually this right, left, and middle. But then once you start going directly to the right, left, and middle, or to the right and left, without having tasted of what made the middle as really the straight line, the straight curve, then you have a problem. Rabbi Ishmael would answer you in a completely different manner, right? Obviously, but what he might likely tell you again, I'm not much of the school of Rabbi Ishmael, though I kind of study and teach every day. But Rabbi Ishmael, I guess, would answer you by saying, well, that's why she said, it says Yuma with her, of saying that yes, okay, it wasn't him that tasted first, and she somehow convinced him, but it's not written so. It's written Vatiten. She gave him. So can you see in the Watiten the fact that she gave him, the fact that she seduced him and she, and enticed him to take it? Well, what you can see on the other hand is that for him, there is the generality of him as Adam, and then you have the particular of her as being the feminine counterpart. So she was part of him. So she took, well, it's a part of him that took it. So it's normal that as she gives it to him, he takes it. See? So these are two different approaches, but none of them see this as being profoundly like so much a mistake on the side of Adam. It's like more a mistake of, or let's say, an impatience on one part which belonged to Adam. And that's why also, when the divine confronts them, he said, Haisha Sher natata imadi, the woman you gave with me, like that's she's the one. But in other words, he's by saying that it's not that it's not that he's just saying, look, it's not my fault. He's saying it's just a part of me. It's that part of me that gave it to me. That's what he's saying.
Oh, beautiful. So I've got coming up to the last question, and that is this idea that after the fall, Adam and Chava did not connect for 130 years until they came again together with Shem, with Shet rather.
Shet.
And I'm just bothered by the idea that God created the two of them. This is the perfect union for him, and he leaves her for 130 years. And I've been reading that in those 130 years, they were connecting with Shadim, with half spiritual entities, and it's just very bothersome to conceive that sort of idea. So I just wondered whether you could shine some light on that.
Well, there's a lot to unpack. Okay, so the first thing that one should unpack is from where does this tradition come? It's not really that he separated from her. It's in the sense that he knew there was something to correct. And we're going to just discuss just a little bit about what is it that he came to actually arrange, to actually correct. And in fasting, as a natural consequence of fasting for those 130 years, he was abstaining from actually a relationship with her. That's what is written, in the Gemara. It's in it's going to come back to me, but
you're saying that the fasting and the abstaining from connecting with Chava was his way of repenting for.
It's actually there are two ideas that are separate, and I know that unfortunately, even in Gemara, one actually merges them as one. There is the idea of Chet Adam. And this Chet Adam, as explained by the Arizal, is really this union before time. It's the fact of unifying with its feminine counterpart before the Shabbat. But there's the other part, which is this famous Zuhama, right? Now, there's a lot of play in this, right? Because if you take the way that it's written in a tradition, as much in the Zohar as the earlier sources in Midrash, one writes Zuhama even without the white. Why? Because Zayin He Mem Aleph has the gematria of 53, which is the gematria of Gan. So the idea is that the Zuhama is like the imprint of the garden. There's once, whatever what happened is that garden left them an imprint. Now you can call it the Zuhama filth, and there's ways to explain that filth. And even one of the ways to explain it, and that's in this discourse of the son of Rav Safra in Parashat Truma, it says there that actually it's not just that Cain and Hevel were the produce, in a way, of Adam and Hawa, is that Hawa had received already this Zuhama, this filth, from a third party. Now, some want to look at this third party as being the Nachash, and some even explain, and that's the Zohar, explains it as being this primate, and calls it even just explicitly kof. And that filth is what Adam wanted to remove from himself. Because as he united with this feminine counterpart, which already had this filth, he became in a way contaminated with this filth. And he had this point where he knew that uniting back with this same woman was only going to reproduce the same problem over and over again. So that's why he actually fasted in order to correct himself. And he not only fasted, but in fasting, it was the most natural thing that he also would not unite with her. Now, it's said in the same Gemara that actually le'unse, it says. In other words, it wasn't voluntary. In not being able to unite with Hawa, he actually has loss of seed. And from that loss of seed, those matters were created. That's like quasi explicit in the Gemara, and clearly in Kabbalah, that's what we talk about. So in other words, these byproducts, those matters, were there, and how do they know? How does the Gemara know that there was such a thing? Because you see, in the language, at the point that Shet is being conceived, it's not written that she conceives, it's written he conceives.
Wow.
And then it's written not like with creation where the divine says bit salminu kid motenu. This time the terms are reversed. It says bid muto ket salmo. And this reversal is what pushes the sages to say there's something going on here. Something is going on, and it means that finally at the point of Shet it was ket salmo, like his image. And if it is ket salmo at that point, then what was before? And so they say, well, what was before? He actually fasted for 130 years. And, there's this idea in the 130 also about what is hidden. The first time that you have actually the gematria of 130 is without otiot sofiyot and things that you can't really explain, is the term hamechase. That is the one who hides. And in a way, that's what he did for 130 years. He was in a form of nidui. That's the term used by the sages. He was separated from his wife, but not just her, separated from the world, separated from food, separated from all that. He actually puts himself in retreat. And there, in this hidden state, he actually corrected. So how you would say, in what way did he correct? Because we said that he has loss of seed. Well, that's the point of the Arizal, is to say that, don't be mistaken. If he had this loss, which was absolutely involuntary, it was in a way to clean him. It's what the Arizal calls Lashon Nikuy, like in Wenake, of saying that it actually cleansed him. Through all that he actually purged, he purged everything which he had obtained from that first union with Hawa.
And yet we know that he's still, and generations after him still hold that imprint of the Zeomah. So
of Zuhama, that's where you have different traditions. You have a tradition in the Zohar that says that actually it was held at different levels, that filth. It was held at the level of Cain or Hevel. And that already at the time of Enosh, that they found their own tikkun for that zuama. It doesn't mean that they found their own full tikkun for themselves, as Cain vehevel, but as a berur out of that zuama, yes, they did, at the point of Enosh. And it goes into saying this very interesting thing, that this berur, as being this purification process, actually takes place through the letters. This is beautiful expression saying that it's the letters who brought fragrance to the world and allow it to purify itself from that generative process that included that filth with it over and over again. But that should not be confused or conflated with what concerned Chet Adam. And the same Zohar in Parashat Truma says actually that Chet Adam really found a last, not expiation, but a form of tikkun through Har Sinai. So in other words, within Am Yisrael, within Bnei Israel, that one had already, in a way, purified what concerned Chet Adam at the point of Har Sinai, the revelation of Har Sinai. But then what happened to the Zuama? Well, that same Zohar says that for Cain and Hevel, it was one process because they were directly concerned, since they were the first ones who actually were generated through that process. But it's from Enosh. That is, you see, there is this prototype about the term Enosh, which is about human. And that same Zohar says that really, what is this Adam Arishon, as people would have imagined? It's not Adam, as we call them, it's Enosh. That is, from Enosh, you have this process, which is very human, in being able to do this purification process, this clarification of the world. And one can say that that this process is what continues till today through the letters of what you could consider as Yehudim, but just the very matter of engaging with the letters that are in the Torah, that by itself is this process of bringing fragrance to the world. And that's why we actually say that the Chet was, stop being something that needed berur by the point of Har Sinai, because it's the revelation of Torah. So this is, the Torah, the words in Torah, the letters in the Torah.
Fascinating. I'll have to listen to this podcast again to really soak it all in. You've packed so much into it. Thank you so much. I want to just leave you with the final question that I'm going to ask all my guests, and that is, how would you define your mission in life as you see it?
Well, I mentioned the letters a lot. So I would say my mission in life is actually to combine the letters, allow this, refinement. In a way, I would say that my mission is that of a silversmith of the Hebraic letters. You see, and through refining them, you actually let this light shine out of them, and you defy many things, including contingency. And in doing so, not only the letters as we talked about, but it's the very notion of Sefer. And this notion of Sefer has to do with really, as it's talked in Sefer Yetzirah, but many after Sefer Yetzirah actually try to engage with that, including writers like Edmond Jabez, for example, a great poet. And one really talks about the Sefer as being this eavesdropping on the message. As a mathematician, it's a lot of what I do. That is, it's not just at the level of predicting things, which goes back to the matter of Nachash, but and that's what Yosef HaTzadik says. Ki nachash yishashar kamoni. If Yosef HaTzadik could say it about himself, so can we. So this mission is about finding back those combinations of letters as spiritual alloys. That's on the spiritual side. On the more tachlis side, it's I've been teaching machines to divine, and I've been teaching them in a way mystical vision. In a way, letters is all that. Letters is about the emergence of shape. Letters is about going from light, where you can differentiate matters and where all you have would be maybe structure, what we would call mathematics topology, and going from topology to geometry, to actual measure. By the way, that discourse I talked about in Parashat Truma contains this idea of Adam before there is actually a measure and Adam after there is a measure. So, presence of geometry. So in other words, give a sense about what is actual shape. That is, if you would try to understand, you think you know what are the letters. In fact, the letters came to their actual shape today in what's called the Ktav Ashuri, through that very flow, of the Tigris. And that's why on the Netiyat Lulav, you will have the same direction, like the four rivers, where you would shake it towards the south, towards the north, towards the east. But at the point of the east, you stop and you do, the up and below. Why? Because only there through the Ktav Ashuri, which was about the third river, could one get a sense about the letters. And so you have the letters above and the letters down, and that's what you relate to. And then you can go back to the west, and there in the image of a Gan Eden and there of those rivers, is that from there you would look toward the west, and what did you have? Eretz Israel. That was the matter.
Beautiful. I am so grateful to you, Rabbi Yirmiyahu. I'm so grateful. Thank you for sharing your incredible wisdom and depth and knowledge so gracefully. And perhaps you should come back for Parashat Truma and finish off that thing on the Adam.
Or Parashat Mishpatim and Parashat Truma. I know, I'm joking. Okay.
Very good. Have a blessed week, and please God, we'll see you soon.
And a wonderful year, B'ezrat Hashem.
Thank you. God bless. Bye-bye.
Amen.